welcome to the March 21st Utility and Commerce Committee hearing. In the interest of time, we're going to start as a subcommittee, so I wish those folks in the audience would take their seat. Ms. Torres, if you're ready, you can start presenting your bill at this time. Ms. Torres, we're hearing AB 770, is that correct? Okay, thank you. Whenever you're ready, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. As you know, I was a 911 dispatcher in the city of Los Angeles for over 18 years. And Assembly Bill 770 deals with that profession. I am attempting to professionalize our profession by standardizing training for 911 dispatchers. Usually 911 dispatchers are the very first point of contact in receiving calls regarding crimes, traffic accidents, medical emergencies, and safety hazards, as well as other requests. Answering 911 calls can be a very highly stressful occupation and demands precise performance in order to effectively relay calls to the appropriate response entity. The demands of the job results in an average reported turnover and vacancy rate of almost 20%. Assembly Bill 770 uses the existence structure of the 911 Advisory Board to provide focus on training and recruitment issues. This bill would add to the Post Commission the state fire marshal and the advisory board to the advisory board and directs the advisory board to consider recruitment and training issues. Specifically, the bill would ask the advisory board to consider issues to standardize recruitment and training for 911 dispatchers and issues related to answering calls in languages other than English. I respectfully ask for your support.
Move the bill.
Let's first establish a quorum. I believe we have one. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Bradford.
Present.
Fletcher. Buchanan.
Here.
Fong.
Here.
Fuentes.
Here.
Furutani. Gurel. Hernandez.
Here.
Huffman. Knight. Ma. Nistandi.
Here.
Skinner. Swanson.
Present.
Valadeo.
Here.
Let's first adopt the 2011 committee rules. So that's what's needed now that we have established a quorum before moving forward. It's been moved by Mr. Fuentes, second by Mr. Hernandez, that we adopt the committee rules for 2011. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Bradford.
Aye.
Bradford, aye. Fletcher. Buchanan. Buchanan, aye. Fong.
Aye.
Fong, aye. Fuentes.
Aye.
Fuentes, aye. Furutani. Gurel. Hernandez.
Aye.
Hernandez, aye. Huffman. Knight. Ma. Nistandi. Nistandi, aye. Skinner. Swanson.
Swanson, aye.
Swanson, aye. Valadeo. Valadeo, aye.
Committee rules are adopted. Thank you, members. At this point, do we have any questions for Ms. Torres by committee members? Seeing and hearing none. Do we have any witnesses in support? Seeing and hearing none. Do we have any witnesses in opposition? Seeing and hearing none. Ms. Torres, you may close. We have a motion for pass, but do we get a second on that?
Second.
And Hernandez seconded on this, so for AB 770. So, Ms. Torres, please close.
Respectfully ask for your support.
This is a due pass recommendation to appropriations. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Bradford.
Aye.
Bradford, aye. Fletcher. Buchanan. Aye. Buchanan, aye. Fong.
Aye.
Fong, aye. Fuentes.
Aye.
Fuentes, aye. Furutani. Gurel. Hernandez.
Aye.
Hernandez, aye. Huffman. Knight. Ma. Nistandi. Nistandi, no. Skinner. Swanson.
Swanson, aye.
Swanson, aye. Valadeo.
No.
Valadeo, no.
Yes, that's not out, so we're going to leave that on call for you, Ms. Torres. Thank you. Next up is Mr. Hill, AB 56. Mr. Hill, when you're ready,
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and members, first of all, I want to begin by thanking the chair and the committee staff and members of this committee, especially Ms. Ma, who does represent part of San Mateo County, for traveling to my district on December the 7th, touring Ground Zero, where the San Bruno explosion occurred, and participating in the legislative forum where we questioned regulators, utilities, and industry experts. I think we learned a great deal, and I know the local residents appreciated it immensely. On September 9th, 2010, at 6:15 p.m., Line 132, a 30-inch natural gas transmission pipeline owned and operated by Pacific Gas and Electric Company, ruptured in San Bruno, California. The force of the rupture launched a pipe segment 100 feet away from its original location and left a crater 72 feet long and 26 feet wide. An explosion and fire ensued that killed 8 of my constituents, injured dozens more, and destroyed 38 homes. Although the cause of the explosion is still being investigated, extensive federal and state hearings have revealed serious flaws in the way California regulates the owners and operators of natural gas pipelines. AB 56 places new standards on utilities and regulators to hold them more accountable for ensuring the safety of our state's aging pipeline infrastructure. This bill makes a number of common-sense reforms that results from what we've learned as a result of the San Bruno explosion. These are, number one, ensures that ratepayer money should not be used by a utility to pay for any penalty or fee assessed by the California Public Utilities Commission. If a utility is penalized, the responsibility should fall to its shareholders who control the company, not to ratepayers. Number two, instructs the PUC to consider the safety record of public utilities when determining the rates that each utility will be allowed to charge its customers. In 2004, PG&E's leak rate was 6.2 leaks annually per 1,000 miles of transmission lines serving high-consequence areas. This was more than 6 times the average leak rate for the nation's 6 other large pipeline operators. Number three, it requires the PUC to establish minimum standards to install either automatic or remote shutoff valves where feasible. It took PG&E approximately 90 minutes to shut off the gas to San Bruno. The damage caused by the fire would have decreased if the gas flow had been cut off earlier. The fire was too intense to reach the manual valves. If there had been remote shutoff valves in place, it would have taken only 10 to 15 minutes to shut off that gas. Number four, it orders utilities to annually submit performance measure reports to the PUC regarding any pipeline problems that were identified and any conditions that require repair. It also directs utilities to share their emergency response plans and any information regarding the pipeline system with state and local emergency responders. San Bruno's fire chief and many local emergency responders did not know that a gas transmission distribution line ran through their service area. It wasn't until after the explosion that the utility sat down with local emergency responders and had a comprehensive safety conversation. It also requires by January 1st, 2022, that utilities upgrade their facilities and pipelines to accommodate for state-of-the-art inspections, including inspection tools such as the robotic pigs. The segment of Line 132 that ruptured had been tested by PG&E twice within the calendar year prior to the explosion. However, we now know that that type of testing done on that pipe was not appropriate for determining its stability. The bill also directs the PUC to track proposed repairs cited by a gas corporation in a rate-making proposal. And if that ratepayer money is diverted to a different project, it requires that a utility make a public filing justifying that change. As the committee's analysis points out, through the rate-making process, the PUC authorizes expenditures for maintenance but does not follow up with each project to ensure that the money was appropriately spent. In the weeks after San Bruno, we learned that in 2007, PG&E was approved to spend $4.9 million to replace a segment on Line 132, but the work was never done. In 2010, the utility was asking for an additional approval of $5 million for the same project. This is a problem that must be addressed. I'm not working to tie the hands of utilities. I simply want more transparency and accountability as to how ratepayer dollars are being spent. And finally, this bill instructs utilities to prioritize the safety and oversight of pipelines that are next to high-risk seismic areas. AB 56 seeks to make needed reforms to ensure that the PUC is adequately regulating the pipeline industry. that utilities are operating safely, and that there is increased accountability and transparency over California's management of its vital pipeline infrastructure. This bill is not perfect, but it's a good start for comprehensive reforms that will improve the safety for all Californians. And I'm committed to continue working with all of the stakeholders involved to address their concerns and to take amendments that will improve this bill. Members, as lawmakers, we have the opportunity and the obligation to take every step possible to ensure that the lessons of this tragedy are well learned and that the circumstances are not repeated. And again, I want to thank Ms. Ma for being at the hearing, the forum we had in San Bruno, and since she does represent part of San Mateo County, and we appreciate that and her support at that hearing. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Any questions for Mr. Hill? Mr. Fuentes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also want to sort of commend the author in, I think the goals of this bill are very important, and although we didn't have a tremendous amount of time to talk, I'm pretty concerned about some of the sort of outstanding, I guess, improvements that we're waiting on to see go forward in this bill. I guess I'm going to start just sort of on page, I guess it's 5 here of the bill, and I think it's very explicit here that this annual performance measure shall be made publicly available in a way so that it doesn't risk or compromise public safety. And you're suggesting here that you talk to the Department of Homeland Security and trying to figure out how you get this information out to the public, yet maintain it in a way so that it doesn't pose a risk to any of the structures or any of the utilities or any of these valuable assets. Is that being done in any other state? Or how do you sort of reconcile that need for, at least as proposed in the bill, the need for getting the information out so you know what sort of the safety levels are of the bill, and how do you reconcile that with sort of the, I think, vital security aspects of this sort of infrastructure?
The security aspects of knowing where the pipe is and how it's running through someone's neighborhood.
Right.
Through
Yeah,
the
you
home
wouldn't want to have that information out there sort of loosely put, especially when you're talking about this particular accident where you know sort of the PSI for pipe and sort of where it's vulnerable and the type of welding and where it needs to be upgraded. I mean, I assume that this report would sort of outline where the infrastructure needs to be addressed. And if we're exposing the vulnerabilities of the infrastructure in a publicly sort of type available setting, how do you do that?
Well, I would have to say that that's being done currently when a utility is asking for funds to make a repair on a particular line. They're asked to make that repair on a specific spot, an identifiable spot in that line that has a particular risk. As the comment that I made earlier in this part about 2.8 miles north of the ruptured spot, there was a spot that had a risk identified. They received funding for that risk, and that was the area that was going to be repaired. So it was identified, and that's a normal procedure. If you're talking about in the broader sense of when this report is made and they're identifying certain areas of concern or vulnerability, which I think is where you're going, Mr. Fuentes, then I think that the pipeline, the security aspects of it have already been identified through the fact that the utilities have now come forward with the appropriate location of the pipes, where they run through communities, how they're located, how they're moving through, and at what point they traverse a community. So the fact that the pipes are located where they are is already known. And if you're saying that there's a problem with the pipe, this particular pipe that ruptured, there was no known fact of what the condition was of that pipe, so it was never brought forward that it had bad welds or it had a problem there. So I guess what I'm saying is that the information is already known, where pipes are located, how they run. There's no federal law that requires anyone to preclude or prevent that information from becoming public. PG&E in this case made comments that they did not want to divulge or identify those locations for security reasons, but that was an internal concern of theirs, not anything that we've understood as a homeland security or a federal issue.
So you're saying this information is already available and it's already known where the vulnerabilities and this sort of thing are? I mean, it seems to me that it's establishing a new annual performance measure. So this is not new?
Well, if you're talking about performance measurements, the performance measurements are what standards that they have to abide by, what conditions that are located of the pipes, and where they have met the goals that they've established and how they've performed in that area. If there are vulnerabilities in the pipeline, in the system, those would have been identified, and they would have been moving forward with every particular rate cases and coming forward with certain plans to make those repairs, make the repairs.
So I guess the question again, just to simplify it, so this is not a new report that's available? You're not asking for a new report?
We are asking for a new report on the performance of the, I'm sorry, excuse me for 1 second. Right. The reports are it's new information that would be released, and information to talk about, to disclose what their performance has been and how they're planning to move forward with that. And in that standpoint, you can then make a decision and determination as to how to move forward in dealing with the utility and in terms of rates and in safety considerations and other things.
Okay. Well, let me move to another section here. I guess that causes me, I think, more pause on the measure. So I guess right now the PUC has an open proceeding on this issue, or has the proceeding been closed?
A proceeding on
the San Bruno, yes.
Well, they haven't. They have different investigations. They've started one investigation on one area.
Are any of the investigations closed?
No.
So they're all open.
Correct.
And so I guess on page 6 of the bill here, you've got what is sort of concerning to me is that you're suggesting that whatever the outcome of the independent review panel is, notwithstanding that outcome, that automatic and remote shutoff valves be installed as well. I guess what concerns me is that the independent panel review, the IPR here, isn't complete, but the bill is already speaking to outcomes that need to happen before this report is complete. If you look at line, I guess section 7 there, page 6, where you would require the owner or operator of a commission-regulated gas pipeline facility to comply with minimum standards established by the commission in consultation with the independent review panel investigating the San Bruno natural gas pipeline explosion of 2010 to install automatic or remote shutoff valves unless technically unfeasible according to the following timeline. So you're prescribing, I guess, an installation sort of process, yet we don't know if that's sort of the remedy that the IPR is going to suggest, or unless there's some information that is unavailable to me at this point. Is that what the IPR, is that where we're going with the IPR?
The The independent review panel the conclusions are coming out in about a month, and we will be able to see what the issues related to this particular event were, and their needs and the concerns that they have. The idea is where technically unfeasible, and I think that's the key term, automatic or remote shutoff valves should be installed in the system, and that's correct. Regardless of the outcome, the independent review panel investigating the San Bruno explosion will have their determination, and where automatic shutoff valves are not unfeasible in their determination, they would be feasible with this bill, automatic or remote.
I see. All right. And I guess the other part that sort of causes me some concern here is on page 7, section F here, about the negligence sort of, let's see here, you've got gas corporation shall not recover in rates any uninsured expense resulting from a fire, explosion, or other catastrophic event involving commission-regulated gas pipeline facility that resulted from negligence by the utility. I guess my biggest concern here, and I agree with, I think, the premise, the underlying premise that's being suggested here, my concern here is that I feel as if this is now sort of stepping in the shoes of the PUC. I mean, it seems to me that that's where the PUC should be making these determinations, and I'm very reticent to want to make that determination in statute. And I can't sort of give you a scenario where I think it would otherwise not work, but it just seems to me that that's what the PUC is for.
Well, the PUC needs guidance, and they need some policy decisions, and that's why we're moving forward with that. I'm moving forward with this bill. Sure. Negligence should be a criteria that is established. Now, whether it's negligence or some other level of negligence, that's the discussion, and that's where we're moving with the stakeholders to try and develop how, you would define that responsibility and at what level that is. And that's the real question. And I think no one can assume that that negligence should not be taken into consideration, and that if a utility is held in some form of negligence, that they should not be able to recover those costs from the ratepayers. They should be shareholder responsibility, just as fines or any other negligence suits from any other corporation in the state should be held responsible for the bottom line, not from the ratepayers.
Sure, and I, like I said, I can't think of a situation where that wouldn't work, but I just don't know that I would want to lock that in statute. It seems to me that the PUC is dynamic and flexible enough to make that determination. And my concern, I guess, overall with the bill is that we have, and rightfully, a lot of investigations proceeding, NTSB, IPR, and the PUC, each, I think, have got sort of a piece of this, but there hasn't been any real conclusion drawn by any of those agencies. And I can imagine that we can all guess that they're going to suggest more could have been done, and I think we're all looking forward to those recommendations. I just don't feel very comfortable moving on a bill that doesn't sort of cement those recommendations in language. And like I said, you should be commended for your absolute attentiveness to the issue and the proceedings, and I think all of the information that's being gathered around this terrible tragedy. I just don't know that I could support a measure at this point at the first meeting of the Utilities and Commerce Committee to move out of committee without any, I think, sort of more work to be done here. So unfortunately, I can't support the bill in its current form. I don't want to vote against the bill, but I won't be voting on the measure, and I would strongly suggest that we figure out how to tie up or at least get some more information into the measure before it were to move out of committee. But I do not chair the committee, and it's the committee's chair and will, I think, to move the bill out if they so wish, but I won't be voting for the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Fuentes. Mr. Valadeo.
My question kind of falls along the same path on that section, is who would actually define negligence?
And that's the question. Who would define negligence?
Yeah.
Well, that's a legal definition, and the courts would define negligence.
It'd be settled in the courts then, anything, or?
Well, that's generally how it would be handled today. The CPUC does not define it and does not interpret that in cases like that.
Mr. Swanson.
Well, I too want to commend the author for the hearings and all the work on behalf of constituencies that really have developed a lot of concerns around accidents like this and the consequences. And when there's a loss of life, I think it's important for us to figure out what our responsibility is to act. So I certainly commend you, Mr. Hill, on that. I think that when we move forward on these bills, it's really important that we examine all the possibilities of unintended consequences. I mean, I think that's part of where some of the questions are coming in. It certainly is not behind the motive of the bill and the direction of the bill and what has to happen. So the question I had, and so I guess on the determination of liability, this would remove the PUC from being able to grant any relief on liability that could be involved in any rate increase. Is that right?
If I understand the question.
Well, if there's an accident, if there's an accident
yeah. Where negligence is proven, or gross, however we define negligence, and what threshold that's established. The question is, if that were determined, then, and the utility was found to be negligent in their behavior and their actions that caused that expenditure or that whatever event that occurred, then the cost from that could not be passed to ratepayers.
So public utilities should not recover any fines or penalties at any rate approved.
They could not fines or penalties either. Just as any business in California can't.
And the utilities when they want to protect their liability and they have to get insurance to do that, is that an action that's approved by the PUC, that their ability to how much
insurance that they have?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the specifics, and there's someone from the PUC here that could probably.
Do
answer that.
you assume though in any insurance that they get that part of the how they pay for that, the premium of that.
Premiums are paid for by the ratepayers.
Yeah, premium. And so I'm trying to understand how, on one hand, after the fact, if there's an accident, that there's no way to recover liability there, but in developing the scope of insurance to protect liability and to encourage liability, isn't that an incentive then for the utilities to buy more insurance? If they're feeling that they're totally exposed from recovery of liability, which is kind of an uninsured liability, if in fact they have too little insurance, and the ratepayers, wouldn't this be then an incentive for them to overinsure?
Well, I don't think so. I think it depends on how you define, and that's where we're working with the stakeholders now to define negligence and at what level. But to me, it's in fact.
You understand my point?
I understand your point. You're saying you'd overinsure that ratepayers would be paying more for the insurance, but yet then they're going to also pay if there's no insurance or underinsured for the loss. They pay either way.
Well, but that's true. But that's right. So the point is that if PUC had the ability to arbitrate, and to look at a situation and make judgment, if they weren't locked into a prohibition, I'm trying to see where there's potential to strike the balance. So in fact, the ratepayers are not being charged more than they should for insurance because there is this big potentially uninsured liability hanging out there.
Well,
I'm just wondering.
I understand the question.
In terms of uninsured, unintended consequences, I don't want my bill to go up based on something that may not happen. If there's a way we can strike a balance,
right.
That's fair.
I understand what you're saying. That the concern is if they have to insure for risks that they don't currently have, or for potential costs that they don't currently have, the ratepayers are going to be responsible for that overinsurance. But by the same, and I don't believe that will be the case, because I think we can develop a standard there that will work, working with the stakeholders, working with the utilities to develop the appropriate balance in the legislation. The concern I have is that in any other business in the state, and utilities are guaranteed a rate of return, that in any other business, if you're negligent in an action, you're held responsible, and that responsibility comes out of your bottom line. And utilities should be subject to that same, and held to that same standard.
Well,
and I think we're trying to find that balance in this legislation, working with the utilities. And as I mentioned in the thing, we're not there yet, but we're close.
So this is so that portion of it is sort of a work in progress.
It is, absolutely.
Because I'm concerned about ratepayers being exposed to higher rates unnecessarily. If there's a way because after each incident, there's a way to evaluate the costs, and the impact. And I think the actuaries for the insurance companies, then they make their assessments too. And I'm just concerned about ratepayers being stuck on the front end with a situation where they're being asked to overinsure because we are restricting PUC's ability to have any flexibility around these circumstances in terms of, the bill says whatever it is, you're stuck with it. So the company may go after the insurance company for a larger insured liability, and the ratepayer has to pay for that liability, that insurance.
They pay either way, but you're right. But we have to find that balance as to when, they pay, if they're paying today, they're paying for increase, whatever insurance costs are, they're paying for those. They're also paying if there's negligence or if there is a loss, whether it's a fire or something else, they pay for that as well if the insurance doesn't cover it. So they're paying, they're paying for the insurance, they're paying for the loss, and what you're saying is that they would pay for a greater insurance premium to cover that down the road.
With the provision that says, after an incident, there's no way to recover the costs. So that would put pressure on before an incident to have larger premiums.
It could, but we're going to try and craft something within this ordinance, within this law, to solve that, so that doesn't occur. That's what we're working with them to try and identify and define that word negligence in a level that protects the ratepayer, but at the same time allows the utilities to go on and continue with their business without feeling threatened by extensive litigation or costs that could come at the end.
All right, Mr. Nastandi.
Actually, just kind of following up on that line of thought. Well, the ratepayers, assuming that the insurance covers whatever happens, their insurance will go up, presumably, and the ratepayers will be paying more through higher insurance premiums. But I guess my question of concern is also taking the PUC out of it in the sense that if it's, I can't think of a circumstance, but if it's egregiously horrible and if they go bankrupt, ultimately then who's going to determine how to get out of bankruptcy? Do they come back to the legislature and then say, okay, we're going to allow you to raise rates then? Who's going to be, because there's only so many ways they can recover that cost, and going forward, like going back to the crisis that we had.
Thank you.
So I guess my question is, what would happen in that circumstance? Who would arbitrate what they can do then to get out of bankruptcy? And there's only so many options. Raising rates is the primary one.
Well, Mr. Nastandi, I think you're raising an issue that is kind of like that. If this, if that, and we may be able to find it. But I think the key is developing that level of responsibility. If we're saying today that they can be negligent, that they can carry on business any way that they like, and the utilities have been responsible. I mean, I give them credit for that most of the utilities have been responsible in the manner in which they do business. But if we're saying that they can be negligent, that they can carry on their business in the manner that they could threaten either property or lives, and that the ratepayers will always be there to bail them out, that's not a fair equation for ratepayers or for the citizens of California. The key in this bill is to define that level of negligence, define that balance that will be the key threshold where they are responsible at a certain level of negligence or whatever you want to call it, how we get to that point, whether it's gross negligence or something. But I feel they have to be held responsible and not the ratepayers.
I agree, and I agree with the premise of the bill. I do. But I guess to Mr. Valadeo's point as well, why are we not defining or helping them define some type of negligence then?
That's what we're working with them on. That's what we're trying to develop is what that is today. We haven't. That's the one area where we haven't come to an agreement, and we're committed to working with them till we do.
What's the disagreement? Has there been intense back and forth on this?
No, there hasn't been intense. There have been a couple of suggestions, language discussions. We're trying to look at the word gross negligence rather than negligence to see if that is a term, and we're struggling with the Ledge Council to come up with that definition of gross negligence. They had some language that they suggested, but it would create a situation where if an officer of a company directed an action and then that action were to be to cause damage, then that would be how you would define negligence. But if anyone else were to do that, it wouldn't. I mean, that's a little too broad of a definition for us, and we'd like to see something a little tighter. So we're trying to develop some balance in that regard, and I think we'll be able to do that.
And do we know if is there a precedent for this? Maybe not here in other states where they have done something like this?
I don't know if there are, but I would hope there would be. And I'd certainly be happy to look and find some. But I would think that other states would be doing this, but I'm not sure. Haven't looked.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Handy. Ms. Buchanan.
Thank you. And I don't know if we have witnesses for and against or others that, yeah, okay. So the PUC isn't finished with its investigation, and the NTSB hasn't finished with its final report. But we're writing a new bill to address the issue.
these are the issues. The issues that I've raised today have come from the investigation, have come from the comments made at the NTSB hearings. They've come from the CPUC concerns that have been raised through the entire process of hearings and disclosure. What we're going to see from the NTSB, in my understanding, in 6 months, will be in fact, we know fairly well closely what caused the explosion. I mean, that has been identified as what actually ruptured, why it ruptured. They haven't gotten into the details. But all of the information has been disclosed at that point in terms of the cause of the event has been identified. The investigation is looking at some of the other aspects of that, but these items that we're addressing here have all come from as conclusions from and weaknesses in the information that has been determined.
Are there final recommendations in terms of how to deal with them?
The final recommendations from the NTSB, I don't know, they will cover these issues.
Right.
They're not going to cover negligence in terms of accidents. They're not going to talk about cost recovery from ratepayers or from shareholders.
Well, on the one hand, I'm inclined to vote to move this bill on. On the other hand, when I take a look at RPS and its journey through this legislature and how much better bill we have now than we had 2 years ago when we were asked to please vote and we'll take 10 amendments later, it's sort of night and day where we were, and that's one of the reasons I asked that question, is because it seems to me it would make sense, even though some of these areas have been brought out, to wait until we had the final recommendations and conclusions. I think it would probably be a more thoughtful process. But let me kind of go in and address a couple other areas. And we've called over to the CPUC to try and get some answers, but haven't connected with them today, because one of the things I have a problem with is it's all ratepayer dollars, whether it goes to delivering the service or upgrading maintenance or goes to taxpayers or the shareholders in terms of dividends. It's all ratepayer dollars, because I don't know of any other way, maybe you know, that the utility collects money other than from ratepayers, right? So
it collects money from ratepayers. However, the difference is all ratepayer dollars, but the difference in this bill addresses that is that the rate of return on their investment changes. So that's the amount of bottom line that the utility gets as profit that then is distributed as dividends to their shareholders.
Right.
That can change based on by their performance, by their safety standards, and by those criteria that are established.
Right,
that's a distinction here. It's all money that comes from the
I agree with
ratepayer.
that, but it all comes from ratepayers. So when we talk about ratepayer money versus shareholder money or whatever, ultimately all the income that the utility gets comes from ratepayers. When I'm just going through these, you can see I've got notes, a fair amount of notes, but one of the things we talk about says it requires the public utility to file quarterly reports with the CPUC and the Division of Ratepayer Advocates describing how the utility is spending ratepayer funds. Currently, how frequently are those reports filed?
3 years.
Okay. And so we're going to go from 3 years to quarterly instead of annually, semi-annually.
That's what we.
Are the rates changing quarterly? How often do the rates change?
It's not the rates; it's how they're spending the money, and that's the concern that we're faced with: is how do they spend the money? Where is that money going? How are they changing the allocations from one purpose to another, or one need to another? And no one knows until 3 years later, and generally no one has been monitoring that aspect.
And right now, I know the DRA is involved in being the advocate for the consumers. What do you see being the change in here? And when we talk about the DRA aligning rate-making policies and practices in terms of its role, in terms of in terms of the actual rates that are set, because it looks to me like you're changing that relationship.
The rates would be established based on right now. Safety is not one of the major concerns or a high priority in rate setting. Nor in other aspects of the PUC's involvement with the utilities. This would raise safety as a higher concern, and would be part of the rate-making structure. So that in terms of, and here again, not wanting to, as Mr. Fuentes was saying, not wanting to be someone to dictate exactly how it would be done. All we're suggesting is that now safety should be a higher priority, and that's what the bill is doing.
And then you want safety taken into consideration when you're determining the rate, a reasonable rate of the return. So I think what you're saying is if a company ignores, because this is more than PG&E, you may be writing it to address the PG&E crisis, but it's going to affect all the utilities. So I guess what you're saying on that is if there's an accident, then you lower the rate of the return. If
No,
not,
I'm saying that it's not necessarily one accident. It's related to a history of safety violations or actions that would show unsafe behavior, unsafe working standards.
shouldn't you be doing more? Shouldn't you be doing more to correct those than just varying the rate of return?
Well, I would
you're-
think the
clearly you're
PUC would be
finding
doing.
them,
That's
right?
part of the PUC's actions
Right.
to start with. What we're trying to do is say that should not be rewarded.
Okay.
That poor safety standards should not be rewarded by a higher rate of return, and today it's not a consideration.
And then I just want to ask if you've considered one of those is to require the public utility to return money to ratepayers if part of what's been approved is for upgrades or safety features, maintenance, and it's not used for that, to return it. Is there a reason you wouldn't just have those monies set aside in a separate account so that stays with that purpose and doesn't fall to the bottom line?
Well, we're looking to see how that can be best utilized, but the challenge has been that in an example, and if I mentioned it, where the utility was able to get funds to make a repair and then did not make the repairs, and then received funds for the same repair 2 years later.
I don't think that should happen, but
So what they did is they used the funds elsewhere, or they could return it back to shareholder money and get it again, and no one knows. There's no accounting of that today.
I understand the purpose. I just want to know, I mean, it seems to me you give me a few cents back, but then I would think there's always going to be some amount of money in the rate for maintenance.
Well, there is, but it needs to be identified and it needs to be
So why wouldn't you put that in a separate account where you hold it in a separate account, you spend your money out of it for maintenance repairs. If money remains in that account, then that should then move forward as part of.
I mean, we can certainly look at that as an issue, but historically, and the reason that we've taken this more aggressive approach is that the utilities have not been forthcoming with the accounting of those funds and where they have gone and how they have been utilized in other priorities. And that's why we want to make sure that they do get back to the ratepayer where they come from to start with.
Returning it directly or whether you're keeping it in an account.
Well, I
think making sure.
I hear what you're saying. Whether ratepayers would get a refund for this, no.
Right.
I would not. That's not how I envision this.
Okay. Well, that's how I apologize. That's how I read it. And then, when I always use my school analogies because I was on the school board for so long, but we have to give a 5-year deferred maintenance plan to the state of California in order to get the money and spend it. And there are sometimes things come up, so you're changing your priorities because something happens and, we had a flood one time or whatever, and your priorities change. How are you dealing with that in terms of the priority list that the utility gives to the PUC? Is there room to be able to adjust priorities within?
Absolutely, and that's what we don't want to do. And what we're hoping is that through this legislation, that the PUC will take a more active role in monitoring the requests, the actions, and the work of the utility, so that they have a way of monitoring and controlling those funds at the end of the day, and the amount of work for that 5-year work plan.
And then I guess my other general question, it comes up here several times, but what appears to me in this bill is that you're designating significantly more responsibility to the PUC in terms of guaranteeing that the construction, the work meets certain standards, which I think is fine. Certainly the PUC is responsible for that, but is there staffing available? I mean, are they going to need more resources, or how? What happens now and what will happen later in terms of making sure that the pipe meets certain standards, that the inspections are done, and I mean, what kind of?
Well, I think the PUC will be making their request if they need additional manpower to do this, and that they just received a few more inspectors last year as a result of the explosion and the information that came from that. So I think that the utilities will, the PUC will, if a problem develops, will make a request to do it. But they are the responsible party to actively monitor, oversee, and hold the utilities accountable for safety as well as for representation for the ratepayer. And over the last, what I've identified is that has not been successful, either through the fact that they've not had the resources or because of whatever culture that they've had, they've not applied that appropriately or taken that action. This legislation will require them to be the regulator that I think they can be, and I think they should be for California. And that's really the key. If it takes more resources, then they can come and make that case.
So it's still not clear to me, are you envisioning them having some kind of role in construction oversight? Or how is the PUC going to guarantee that this be done? And I'm not saying they shouldn't be, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be regulations, but it's just not clear to me.
Well, they have, and I don't quite understand what you're asking in terms of regulation. What should they oversee being done? Is it construction projects?
Well,
or is it applications that are made to the PUC and then someone auditing to make sure that work that was approved by the PUC on behalf of the ratepayers actually gets done?
Well, if I read in here, and I don't know exactly where it was now, but I was reading in here, it sounded to me like they were the PUC was going to have responsibility for making sure that the construction was done properly. I
think if you're talking about construction, is it like gas pipelines? I think that's not a bad idea.
Well, all right.
That they oversee, audit, maybe inspect periodically to check the type of testing that's done on the pipelines when it's completed. Is some type of an inspection.
I think it's important in the bill that whatever new responsibilities we're asking the PUC to do, we make sure there's appropriate funding and staffing so that we can do it, so that they can do it. And my last comment, and I know you're working on the definition of negligence. I'm not an attorney, but I know negligence, gross negligence, all this has different meanings. And, it's always great to assume that every worker does exactly what they're supposed to do all the time. But if you had something where a worker goes to answer the cell phone or whatever and isn't monitor something and something happens, then I don't know if that's the same level of negligence as if someone is intentionally not spending money to replace pipes they know that are unsafe. And I think it's critically important that definition that you get it right. And tied in with that, this will really be the last question. What would you do if an event were large enough that there weren't adequate reserves to cover it? What do you see happening there?
Well, and negligence was, however we define that event did exceed the negligent aspect of it.
Because the goal ultimately is to make sure the rates are reasonable, the pipelines are safe, and people get good service. That ultimately should be the goal, right?
Correct. But if the negligence exceeded the fact that as it would say, the shareholders would be held responsible for that at some level over some period of time.
If you don't have adequate reserve,
I don't.
You're not going to go to the shareholders and ask them to pay more for their stock that they own, are you?
No, you're not, but they may not get a dividend for a while. At 8, 10, or 11% is what some of them are today. So I think that's a reasonable aspect, of expectation, I guess, on the part of the utility. Whether they would, on that circumstance that Mr. Nastandi was referring to is similar to what you've just raised, and that's the issue of a hypothetical. I can't say what would happen in that case or whether that circumstance would ever get to that point. It could happen today where that could occur, and the ratepayer would be held responsible for it. So that has to come within the definition that we develop working with the stakeholders to try and craft something that would limit that to some extent, but also not place the ratepayer as totally responsible.
See, I don't think, the reason you have fines, right, that don't get to be included in the fees is to have compensation for not following the regulations, right? I mean, that's the reason you have fines. I don't think that the cost should necessarily be included in the ratepayer calculation. But the idea, I mean, when you take a look at the banking crisis, you can talk about shareholders, but the people who own Bank of America stock who were retired, who thought they were protecting their 401ks and their IRAs and everything else, and they owned it at $70, and now it's down to $14 a share, getting a penny dividend. Those are a lot of ordinary people that you're hurting. They aren't necessarily people who are, worth millions and millions of dollars. So in terms of what gets calculated in the rates, I can agree with you, but this idea that somehow it seems to me like you're putting up a juxtaposition in terms of shareholders and ratepayers, and your shareholders are also ratepayers, and I think there needs to be some kind of balance, but the balance needs to be a reasonable balance there.
Well, if I could just quickly respond to that, in the case of the San Bruno episode, PG&E is, I believe, estimated $765 million is what that's possibly could cost them. Now that's in dollars and cents, and if they're planning to place that on the ratepayers or shareholders. But there are 8 people that lost their lives in that place. People's lives have been destroyed, families have been destroyed. And the cost of that, I think, is the issue that we're looking at today, more importantly than we are for the person that may not get a dividend for a period of time. And that I think is the cost factor that we have to look at. It's more important that the ratepayer, I think, be made whole.
I'm not saying that the victim shouldn't be made whole. I'm not saying the ratepayer should have to cover it. I'm just saying I also think there's got to be some kind of reasonable balance when you take it all into consideration.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do. And
I think that's where we're going to get. Just in an interest of time, thank you, Ms. Buchanan. I'm going to take witnesses in support. I know, Ms. Skinner, you want to go now, or you want to? Let's take our witnesses in support. So we have quite a few people here.
Lenny Goldberg on behalf of TURN, representing small ratepayers. We believe that this bill speaks directly to a number of concerns that have come out of the process since this terrible accident and address them in a fair manner. Just to mention a few things that were raised, we participated in the settlement with PG&E on gas pipeline safety. And when we say settlement, what happens is that ratepayers and the utilities and the commission come together and say, this is how the expenditure should go. What we then found out, and this speaks to one of the pieces of Mr. Hill's bill, is that when we agreed on this settlement that we were going to pay for these safety improvements, that money was, as it turns out, was not expended as we understood it. And that may have been delays, and it may have been planning, and I can't speak specifically to what happened there, but we do know that we agreed as ratepayers to say, yes, we're going to pay this money for these safety improvements that for one reason or another were put back till 2012 and when they were approved in 2009. With regard to the question of reporting and accountability, as this speaks to, part of the issue is to know that if we've signed off on a settlement and our rates are going there, is to increase the transparency and say, this is actually what is being done with what you've agreed to. Now, I'll cut these short, but I do have one other thing about the culture of the Public Utilities Commission in the past and what I think it will be with this bill and going forward. New Commissioner Mike Florio, who said he was touring the building and he went down on the second floor, which is where the safety division is, and they literally met with a number of the safety employees that deal with railway safety, with pipeline safety, with utility safety generally, and they said they had never ever seen a commissioner even set foot on the second floor, let alone meet with them. So we truly think that this bill based on what we know now, obviously there will be further recommendations coming along, but based on what we know now, sets the right balance, increases the level of visibility, creates the transparency, speaks directly to certain problems that have come out since then, and we support it.
Thank you. Mr. Cross.
Mr. Chair and members, Kent Kaus with Pacific Gas and Electric. We have adopted a supportive amended position on the bill. We share a number of the concerns that have been discussed here today. As the committee analysis notes, in October of last year, we adopted a Pipeline 2020 program. This bill seeks to codify many of those provisions that are contained in our Pipeline 2020 program. We do share some of the concerns that have been raised here, and I'd like to go through a couple of them. One of them is making sure that there is a balance on the rate-making piece. There's been comments made about not spending money for this project or another. We actually spent more money on maintenance than was totally authorized within rates, and that money came out of shareholder pockets. It may not have been for Project X. It may have been for Project Y. When we do the rate making, we are looking 2 to 5 years into the future. General rate cases are every 3 years. You file them well in advance of that new GRC taking effect. In fact, we are writing now our next GRC. We don't even have the current decision for the current pending general rate case. So we're looking forward on projects. The individual project work may change from one course to another, but maintenance dollars are always spent on maintenance, capital dollars always on capital. We don't spend maintenance dollars on call center operations or anything like that. It is all accounted for and audited. So that's an issue. We want to make sure that the legislature avoids legislative rate making and let the PUC do their job there. And we support the idea of check-ins at the PUC, but want to avoid the unintended consequences that seem to always happen when the legislature wants to get into rate making. The other issue is on the issue of negligence. We agree with the concept, but want to continue to work on the actual language to make sure that we can deal with those issues. We have a proceeding going at the PUC now dealing with wildfires, and anything that we do here will also impact the wildfire discussion, and just want to make sure there's consistency on how we define what it is as the ultimate goal that we're trying to reach. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kaus. Mr. Randolph.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is Edward Randolph with the Public Utilities Commission. The Commission has not voted to take a formal position on this bill as of yet. It's on our agenda for this Thursday. However, our legislative subcommittee, which is made up of 2 of our 4 current commissioners, did take a position of support with technical amendments last Wednesday. We have shared the amendments. I think the full committee will be asking for on Thursday with the author's office and with the committee late last week. Would like to note on the bill that since San Bruno, thanks is probably the wrong word since this is an awful situation, but due to our own internal looking, due to some very quiet and polite nudging from the assembly member, and from some other places, a number of deficiencies have been exposed. I think both with PG&E's processes and, from my view, more importantly, with the PUC's on rate-making process and oversight process. And we think the bill is addressing a number of issues that have already been uncovered and have been discussed, and are addressing those in the appropriate manner. We'll also acknowledge that we have opened a rulemaking to consider the issues that have already been brought to public, and issues that may come out of the NTSB report and from the independent review panel. And that proceeding's ongoing and will allow for a lot of rulemaking. We also have a investigation open up looking back at some of the actions that PG&E has done. So we're on our way of looking at this, but we think this bill will help augment that and will hopefully put some of these rules into stone, where if 10, 15 years from now, while the current commission staff, I can guarantee you, is not going to continue in the same way we have in the past after lessons learned, but future commission staffs will also continue to put safety as one of the top priorities. I'd like to note, if you'll indulge me for a second, just to address a few issues that have been raised with the bill so far. On the insurance issue, on the issue of recovering rates and negligence, I now don't have my notes who brought it up, but a concern was brought up of, wouldn't this encourage the utilities to overinsure? Mr. Swanson, we raised that same concern, and one of the amendments we'd like is some clarity to give us clear authority to and instructions to review the utilities insurance policies to make sure they don't have an incentive to overinsure. Ms. Buchanan raised concerns about the quarterly reports. We agree quarterly reports will probably result in a lot of documentation to the commission that we won't have the resources or wherewithal to do with them. Our understanding of the overall bill was the main intention was to make sure that there's a lot more transparency in what's going on with the utility safety money. And if that's the case, we'd suggest the bill be amended to require reports on a regular basis to the utility on the utility safety spending, and that will enable our staff to review that and cross-division, and we'll give DRA in turn access to those reports as well. We think half-yearly would probably be more appropriate than quarterly. And then the conversation on returning unspent safety funds to ratepayers. I'll note in the current ongoing proceeding on PG&E's cost recovery for their transmission pipelines now, there's now what's referred to as a reverse balancing account, which by and large does what the bill suggests. So we do have that authority today. In the bill, we do read it as requiring a rebate back to ratepayers for unspent funds. We'd like amendments to that to give the PUC more flexibility to either decide to keep it within the safety accounts going forward, or to maybe spend it in other ways that are directly ratepayer benefited. But oftentimes a rebate back to the ratepayers wouldn't be the most cost-effective way to spend it. And finally, to Ms. Buchanan's points on do we have the resources, I hope you can be the chair of Sub 3 next year when we're asking for the additional resources. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Duff. Any more witnesses in support? Witnesses in opposition?
Good afternoon, Kelly Boyd thank you on behalf of Southern California Edison. We are opposed unless amended, and we have suggested amendment to section 770.5F, which has been previously discussed. That's the ability to cover uninsured losses in rates, especially in the context of wildfires, which are a huge issue for utilities. And again, we're an electrical corporation, not a gas corporation. That's a very big issue for us, and we want to continue to work with the author to refine that language, make it reasonable. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members, Cindy Howell with Southern California Gas Company and San Diego Gas and Electric. While historically it sounds like there might not have been a culture of safety at the CPUC, I can guarantee you that at Sempra Energy we do have a culture of safety, and it is our number one priority. We support a lot of the provisions in the bill, and I think the general intent of what the legislation is trying to accomplish. And we've had a lot of discussions with the author and staff related to the various provisions. We will note that with regard to the ongoing investigations and the CPUC investigations, with regard to determining what happened, looking at ways and coming up with their conclusions as to how to make the system safer, and also SoCalGas is doing its own internal investigation and looking at how we would recommend should we want to turn the dial up on safety, what we think would be the best use of funds to do that, and we anticipate having some recommendations in the next couple months. So completely looking forward to the process of refining this legislation, but there are a couple provisions which are a huge concern and which has caused Sempra Energy Utilities to take an opposed unless amended position on the legislation. They have been discussed. I want to bring one additional factor to your attention, and that's related to the concept of inverse condemnation. Our biggest concern here is the provision related to prohibition, a statutory prohibition against cost recovery related to the liability that goes beyond what we have insurance to cover. And under a 1990 case law, it was Barham versus Southern California Edison, the appellate court determined that utilities could be found liable in inverse condemnation. And what that means is that there is no fault. It's strict liability for the utilities should their infrastructure cause damage. And the purpose of that is it was determined by the court that we could spread costs to our ratepayers, so they would prefer that the utility have the liability in those situations rather than any independent individual homeowner. But what that means is while we can buy insurance to mitigate a lot of our risks associated with employee negligence and gross negligence, what we have a harder time managing risk for is the notion of any and all liability regardless of cause related to incidents from disasters. We can't manage damage related to natural disasters like wildfires, potentially earthquakes as well. And so when you consider that the utility has liability and inverse condemnation for that, and you could have several wildfire incidences within one policy year, it's pretty quick before we can, or a quick time in which we could reach the limits on our liability. So you put on top of that negligence action on behalf of one of our 14,000 employees, and the utility's inability to control the extent of the damage, and you end up in a situation that could cause huge financial ramifications and potential bankruptcy, as I've heard discussed here today, for the utilities. And October 2007 was a really difficult fire year for San Diego Gas and Electric. We're very concerned about a similar situation in this policy impacting that. Southern California Gas Company, also a very risky business to get into. And that's why it is regulated. We have a regulated rate of return. Our shareholders are, and the utility, our management is incented to run the utility as efficiently and as well as possible in order to provide safe, reliable service at just and reasonable rates. That's what we're required to do. And when you look at other companies that I think something that the assembly member had said, any other business in the state is held responsible. Every other business in the state doesn't have an obligation to serve. And as a regulated utility, we have an obligation to serve regardless of the risk associated with providing that service. So fire-prone areas, we have to provide them service. With regard to our pipeline system, we have to establish our pipeline system that crosses seismic faults in order to provide service. So we mitigate the risk the best we can. We prefer leaving these decisions that really need to be made on a case-by-case basis with the regulator. And as Ed Randolph noted, with CPUC, we've got a new commission that hopefully will afford the legislature a little bit higher comfort level with regard to their decision-making authority. So I recognize that this legislation is intended to address a very specific disaster in San Bruno. We fully look forward to continuing to work with the author, but it does have significant impacts on Southern California Gas Company and San Diego Gas and Electric, which is why unless these concerns can be addressed, we are opposing the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hills, we talked earlier. I think we all share the sentiment of what you're doing in terms of negligence and ratepayers not paying for it. The wildfires that have been mentioned struck my district in 2003 and 2007. CAL FIRE says our district has burned more than any district in California. And so I've in my short time here, gone through a whole series of issues, whether it's dealing with insurance policy, whether it's dealing with people rebuilding their home, or now in this case in terms of how we deal with these where there's overlap. And so I am absolutely supportive of not putting ratepayers on the hook for negligence. And going through some of these others, I've learned that getting it right and figuring it out is vitally important too, for any unintended consequences. So I appreciate your working on the amendments, particularly on the definition of negligence, to work out some of the concerns from San Diego, and look forward to being helpful in whatever constructive way I can to making sure that gets right, but before the good intentions of this bill become law.
Thank you. Ms. Skinner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will move the bill, and I'm going to take the understanding from the author that as you addressed when you opened, that there are some of the points around like definition of negligence, and also on the issue of let's see, I'll
Reporting.
underlined. It was point number 10 in the committee analysis around the precluding the utility from covering any rates and any expense related from such events, that you're also going to be re-looking at that. Those two areas were areas that concern me. On the other hand, I want to thank you for bringing the bill, because I feel that we as ratepayers, when we are served by a regulated entity, I think that we assume that because it's a regulated entity, not just commerce as usual, any kind of competitive business in a marketplace, that we assume that if our rates include some kind of safety measures or maintenance measures, that those things are happening, and that we're being taken care of. And it would appear from this situation that that was not fully the case. Certainly, we have to wait and see what the final NTSB report is, but I think it's very, very important that the CPUC greatly step up its role in terms of ensuring our safety, and that our utilities also, and not assuming that any don't have it as a priority, but rather that when rates are approved for repairs or maintenance, that they in fact be used for that purpose and right away. So I appreciate the bill. I am also moving it with the understanding that you will be addressing those concerns. So thank you.
Thank you. As well as the issues that Ms. Buchanan raised.
Right.
Swanson.
I assume that the statements and the issues relating to brought by the PUC representative, one of overinsurance and exposure ratepayers, is that also on the
Absolutely, that's part of that balance we have to strike, and happy to work with the chair to develop that right balance to make sure that that ratepayers aren't paying for overinsuring a risk that may never develop.
I'm also I'm hopeful that we don't tie the hands of the regulators in this and allow them to do their job. Essentially, because if you tie the hands too tight, then you almost have rendered the situation unregulated. I think that everyone is sort of committed. You've given a testimony from utilities. Everyone is committed to developing a piece of good public policy, but it's going to require you to continue to have these discussions so that the oppositions can be removed with very thoughtful consideration. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's the only way that this bill, would be to the floor. I think get to the floor unless there's some serious, thoughtful consideration given to many of the concerns that have been raised here, with all of us sharing the same objective, and that is to make the operation safe for the public. I mean, that's kind of the mission.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Hernandez?
Yes, I'd like to second the motion and just kind of speak to some of the considerations brought before us. I think ultimately at the end of the day, as California lawmakers, we have an obligation to protect our constituents. And I don't think any of us here are unfamiliar with the outcries by the communities, both in the San Bruno area and throughout California. And certainly the negligence and the liability and where it lands should not be shouldered by the consumers. I think it should be shouldered by the party held responsible. And I heard both quotes. I heard the quote about every other business is held responsible, but not every other business is pretty much given what looks to be a significant monopoly in the market. Sempra in the south and PG&E up in the north. These are huge markets. Any other similar industries in any part of America would love to have your share. And I think at the end of the day, my hat tips off to Mr. Hill, Assemblymember Hill. I think what you're doing is answering the call of your constituents and Californians. I'm happy to second this motion. I hope it moves forward fluidly. And at the end of the day, we shouldn't be making arguments if they're not arguments as lawmakers, if they're not arguments that are primarily focused on protecting our folks. If someone as a contractor is doing a job at one of my family's properties, a concrete job, and it injures somebody or injures a family member or a tenant, I don't want my family to pay for that injury, and nor do I want my neighbors to have to pay for that injury. And certainly I'm confident that Mr. Valadeo, if the vet comes out and does work on your cattle, you certainly don't want your family to have to pay for the death of your cattle or your neighbors to have to pay for the death of your cattle. It should be the contractor that dispensed the wrong drug or the contractor that did unsafe work with the concrete work. And I think this is pretty fair. It's clear. I'm not confident in the CPUC as being the focused on making sure that consumers are properly protected. I think we've seen some of their work, and at least my work and as a legislator, I've already been disappointed with their lack of advocacy for consumers. So I'm happy to second the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Hernandez. Mr. Fuatani. Okay. I think this has been a very healthy discussion today as it relates to this bill, and I want to also commend the author for all of his hard work, because just to get it to where we are today took a whole lot of coordination, a whole lot of discussion with not only the utilities, with stakeholders, and I know many of us have stated that this is in response to a horrible tragedy, and in many ways it is, but with this horrible tragedy came great opportunity and great exposure of the lack of oversight that we all agree and we all have to admit that exists, be it from the PUC, be it sometimes with the utilities, and not to say that's intentional to oversight, but the amount of work. So I truly understand Ms. Buchanan's question as it relates to a greater oversight for the PUC. Will it require them to hire more people? Will it have more demands on resources? But what's glaring to me is that most of what we were talking about was already the PUC's responsibility. And we have to understand that a lot of that went lapse. So I think in this bill, what Mr. Hill is trying to do is tighten up those restraints, so to speak, or those abilities to enforce, because the PUC was before this committee last week, and surprisingly, they stated they hand out a little bit more carrots than they do sticks. And we're not here to punish anybody. I want to be very clear on that. But at some point, there has to be consequences for your actions or lack thereof. And the PUC has demonstrated, and NTSB and the independent review panel has stated, I think what Mr. Hill has done is taken what has been discovered so far and tried to craft a bill to address those concerns. Is it a perfect bill? No. Has the author made commitments to work with both the utilities and other stakeholders to further define what negligence is? Because I think that is where a lot of the heartburn is, and I think we have a great obligation to drill down a little bit more and narrow that scope of liability. But at the same time, the question has asked, at what point does the ratepayer, shareholders share in some of this responsibility of cost? And as we talk about wildfires, I experienced 3 or 4 in my 12 years with Edison, and I don't know a single time where the utility was held liable by an act of God or a man-made incident that caused that wildfire, even though we lost infrastructure and facilities and customers lost service. So I would love to have an example of when that occurred where they were exposed to additional liability. And if you can provide examples to me or Mr. Hill, I think that would help us in further moving this issue along. But I think at the end of the day, safety is the paramount. And I think if we all drill down, safety is the number one issue that we're concerned about. I have no doubt the utility is committed to it. I have no doubt that PUC is committed to it. But have we all lived up to our responsibilities in doing it in a timely manner? I think we would all have to agree, no. So if negligence is doing annual reports as needed, if it's doing preventive maintenance as needed, is it doing timely repairs, is it providing safety valves where they don't exist to do inspections, I think that's reasonable. And if those aren't done, I think that does create a degree of negligence that has not been lived up to. So On that note, I know we have a motion by Ms. Skinner. We have seconded by Mr. Hernandez. And I would state also what Mr. Hernandez stated on rate of returns. Yes, utilities have an obligation to serve, without a doubt. And they're probably one of the most unique situations being a public regulated. But I don't know anywhere in the country right now where you're getting 11% on your money. And that's pretty good. And all of them are getting 11 or north of 11% on their money right now. So I just think we have to consider that as well. So we have a motion. Mr. Hill, would you like to close?
I will just briefly, because I know the discussion, and I tremendously appreciate the conversation today. I mean, it's been very helpful in a lot of issues in a lot of areas that we will take back if this moves forward and work diligently to define a solution to those and the definitions as required and bring them back in terms of if there are any things you can certainly call the bill back and we'd be happy to address those and present it to you. I just wanted to follow up on, and Mr. Chair, you addressed the issues beautifully. This is not a result of the events in San Bruno. It's not the cause of that. I mean, that's not why we're doing this. We are from one standpoint, and that is in the hearings that have occurred, whether it's the Senate UNC committee, the Assembly UNC committee, the NTSB hearings of last week, congressional hearings. All of these hearings have brought forward some the issues that are related and addressed in this bill. That's where they came from, as weaknesses in the system, as policies that need to be addressed and policies that need to be changed, codified in a way that can give better and broader direction to the PUC to regulate the utility. That's what we're doing here today. This is not related to the specifics of a disaster. It's related to a weakness in the system and a need within the system to make improvements and bring it to something that can better protect the safety of the community. So I respectfully ask your aye vote. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members, for the indulgence today.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Again, we have a motion by Ms. Skinner. We have a second by Mr. Hernandez to do pass to appropriations, but with the understanding that the author has made a strong commitment to work with all stakeholders, utilities, community folks, to move this bill and address some of those outstanding issues, and we reserve the right to bring this back. So, Madam Secretary, call the roll.
Bradford.
Aye.
Bradford, aye. Fletcher. Buchanan. Aye. Buchanan, aye. Fong. Aye. Fong, aye. Fuentes. Furutani.
Aye.
Furutani, aye. Gurel. Hernandez.
Aye.
Hernandez, aye. Huffman. Aye. Huffman, aye. Knight. Ma. Aye. Ma, aye. Nastandi. Skinner. Aye. Skinner, aye. Swanson.
Swanson, aye.
Swanson, aye. Valadeo.
That bill is out 9-0, Mr. Hill, and we have AB 770 still on call, so we'll lift the call and let the absent members cast a vote. Thank you, Mr. Hill, for your efforts.
Thank you, members, very much.
Fletcher. Aye. Fletcher, aye. Furutani. Furutani, aye. Gurel. Huffman. Huffman, aye. Knight. Knight, no. Ma. Ma, aye. Skinner. Skinner, aye.
AB 770 is out 11-3. Members, I believe that concludes our work today for the Utility and Commerce Committee. We stand adjourned. Thank you for your